Morning, everyone. For those who do not know me yet, my name is Ron Levine from Mindfulness and Blue Jeans, and I've been practicing mindfulness and insight meditation for 25 years. And I started during a time when I was dealing with clinical anxiety and depression and a raging panic disorder that had blown up into agoraphobia. So I was on disability from work, unable to leave the house, and happened to get paired up with a psychologist who, even back in 1998, had been teaching and practicing mindfulness and insight meditation for several decades. And that was my introduction to this practice. I didn't think it was going to do anything. And here I am, still practicing, teaching. It's worked out pretty well so far. So I'm going to keep doing it a little while longer, I think. Keep it going. And thank you for being with me here this morning. This is the next in our ongoing series of calming anxiety by living mindfully, where I share some of the tips and techniques that others have shared with me over the years that I've discovered for myself, some that I'm still discovering for myself today. I find that there's a lot of commonality, crossover in this human experience of anxiety, angst, different flavors of fear, right? And so some of these techniques resonate with some folks, some resonate with other folks, some may not resonate with you, but we take the best and leave the rest, right? So let's jump in with today's, okay? I always like to begin my sitting by imagining I'm suspended from the ceiling by a piece of string attached to the top of my head as a nice cue to sit up straight without adding any extra tension to do so. Any tension that may be with us here this morning is allowed to be here with us this morning. We do not need to try to get rid of tension. When we try to get rid of tension, we're trying to force it away by bringing more tension to it. Attempting to find peace through fighting. Funny how that seems like the intuitive default for us. I never found it to work, though. I found that if there's some tension here, I can let it be tension. Tension is a process, so let it process. I also like to notice what is beneath me, holding me up. A chair, a cushion, a floor. Something is supporting me, and I can allow it to do so. I can notice this sense of support from beneath me, this feeling of suspension from the ceiling above me, and whatever else happens to be in between the two right now, however it is. And if you haven't already, you may begin to bring your attention to your breathing. And we can also allow our breathing to be here however it is. Again, it seems to be our intuitive default to try to make the breathing be a certain way. And sometimes we do engage in practices where we try to shape and control the breathing. But we do not have to. And for me, the most powerful practice has often been the one where we're simply watching the breathing as it is. When we're not interfering, not controlling, not shaping. And in fact, it's not until we try to let it be how it is that we start to really see how much, in fact, feel how much we do shape and control it, particularly when we're paying attention to it. And particularly when we're trying not to shape and control it, right? So if we're noticing some shaping and controlling of the breathing, we can just notice that too. We don't have to try to control the controlling. Which again is like trying to get rid of tension by bringing more tension to it in an attempt to force it away. We don't have to fall into that trap. We can let tension be as it is. We can let the breathing be as it is. And if there's controlling happening, we can even let the controlling be as it is. And just see what happens when we do that. Now, last week we spent some time working with tension, physical tension, above the neckline. Shining the light of attention on the crown of the head, the temples, around the eyes, the ears. Noticing the quality of the felt sense in those areas. Again, without trying to control or shape, just bringing the light of attention to them. And seeing the effects of that. I'd like to continue that today with something similar, where we bring attention to the felt sense of something that we often think of as residing above the neckline. The mind. What is the felt sense of the mind? As if it was a physical organ. Not talking about the brain per se, talking about what we conceive of as the mind. This more abstract notion, which is coming from the mind itself, right? Kind of a paradox, isn't it? Our concept of the mind comes from the mind. Well, I tend to be very visual and can readily call forth a mental image of my own mind, which for me kind of looks like a cloud. Thicker in the middle, sort of tapered at the ends. Sometimes moving slowly, sometimes moving quickly. Sometimes it's a little lighter. Air is able to pass through it more easily. Sometimes it's very densely packed together. But there's always some kind of movement, some kind of shifting. Even if sometimes it feels very free and sometimes it feels very constricted. Maybe some of this resonates with you. Maybe you have some other ideas about your felt sense. Of your conception of the mind. Perhaps you're not even sure what that is yet. That's fine too. Because the point here is we are bringing attention and an openness to our experience. Even if we're not entirely sure what that experience is yet. I mean, is there ever a better time to be open to what it might be than if we're not all that sure what it is? So I direct my attention and my breathing, my breath energy, to the felt sense of the mind. The same way I would the crown of my head, my temples, the area around my eyes, my ears. Perhaps you visualize your mind as being in your gut, which, if anything, might be more accurate. Perhaps you might direct your attention and breath energy to it in the way that you would do so with your stomach. And just open to the felt sense of the mind. What's our experience of the mind right now? Does it feel open or closed? Is it malleable or is it tight, brittle? Again, it doesn't matter so much what we find. What matters more is that we are finding it, seeing it, bringing attention to it, and seeing what the effect is of simply bringing attention and breath energy to it, however it is, for some sustained period of time. Even if that's just a minute. Maybe we start in the middle of it. Maybe we start at the edges of it. Allow the breathing to begin to permeate the mind. Give it some literal breathing room. And one of the challenges, of course, of trying to work with the mind is sometimes we work with the mind and sometimes the mind works with us. So, if we get carried away by some thought, storyline, fantasy, memory, fear, desire, well, those are all things coming up from the mind. And something else coming up from the mind is catching that, noticing it, remembering to come back. If we find ourselves upset, that our attention was broken for a while, well, that's coming from the mind too. That's just something else to notice. Like, oh, okay. Trying to bring some attention to this thing that's not used to sitting still. And here's what happens. Maybe get carried away for a while. Then catch it. Then maybe get a little upset. I fell away for a while. Okay. So that's the process of what's arising. It's not a problem. It's what we came to see. We came to see what processes arise, what happens when we bring attention to things, and, oh, we're seeing it. It's not getting in the way of practice. This is our practice. And we come back to permeating the mind with our breath energy. If we started out at the edges, perhaps we're working our way towards the center. If we started at the center, perhaps we're working our way out towards the edges. Perhaps you have another way of going about this entirely. As you go throughout the rest of your day or evening, you may come back now and then and check in. What is the felt sense? The quality of the mind, as if it was a physical organ. And what happens when we simply shine the light of attention on it? Breathe into it, around it, through it. Not in an attempt to make something happen, simply to see what does happen. And that's really the heart of this practice, is trying different things and seeing what happens. And then using that information to put the best causes and conditions in place. For our path to unfold in the best way possible. Thank you, everyone. I'll hang on for a few moments if anyone would like to share any questions or observations in the chat. Hey, Kai. Felt so good. Feels like I learned a lot in the past 2 months. That's awesome. That's great. Cheers. Cheers for that. Hey, Linda. Glad this resonated for you. I was so grateful that my mind is open and ready to receive. Yeah. That's some of what I was getting at with when I was talking about, even if we're not sure what our experience is at the moment, is there ever a time when it's more important to simply be open to it than if we're not actually sure what it is? And that's one of the big catch-22s we run into as humans, right? Is when there's something we're not sure about, do we typically open up to it to find out what it is? No. We shut down because, well, we don't know what it is. Could be danger, right? Even if it's something coming from within our own mind. Interesting, isn't it? When there's something in our own mind we're not sure about, even then, we kind of close down from it. We're not even trusting what's inside. And the big catch-22 there is when we shut down from something, close off from something that's uncertain because we don't like the uncertainty. Well, it continues to be uncertain because we keep shutting off from it, so we never find out what it is. So we're perpetuating the uncertainty, which perpetuates the shutting down, and we've created a nice little vicious cycle for ourselves. So we often fall into the trap of thinking the way to solve that is to simply no longer have uncertainty. So we try to achieve total certainty. I think we all know at some level that doesn't really work. It doesn't stop us from trying, though. At least it didn't stop me from trying. And the way to actually skillfully work with that isn't to try to stamp out any uncertainty, because we can't do that. We open up to it. We open up to that. And that's really what a session like today's is about. And at some level, they're all about it, right? But in particular, that's really the theme of this is, okay, whether we know what's here or not, whether we think we know what's here or not, can we open up to that either way? Or at the very least, if we're not ready to open up to it, can we be open to the possibility of opening up to it? That counts too. So I'm glad that resonated for you. Cheers. Kristen, grateful for this visualization this morning to help me focus. Yeah, I'm extremely visually oriented. So we want to find a way to work with what is natural for each of us. So if I'm very visually oriented, which means that I also find distractions tend to come up in the visual sphere. So what I mean is when I'm engaging in my sitting, usually what will start to pull me away, the first thing that'll come up is some kind of mental image. So again, the natural sort of tendency there can be to, well, I just need to stamp out having mental images. Like, okay, good luck. I find it's better to work with the fact that I'm very visually oriented. So not trying to stop being visually oriented, but working with it. What's the best way to work with this tendency so that I'm not engaging in what I was talking about in the early part of today's sitting, where we're trying to find peace through fighting, trying to find relaxation by bringing tension to tension and so forth. So it's not about fighting our nature. It's about working with it. That's where this creativity and experimentation comes in. What's the thing in like jujitsu, I think it is, where you're using your opponent's power against them. So you're not really fighting them. You end up making it so that they're kind of fighting themselves. And if there's one thing I found in this practice, it's that fighting yourself doesn't end well. Miriam, thank you for pointing towards a friendliness to my precious brain. Yeah. Isn't it funny? Isn't it funny? Our default when we are feeling some kind of distress, our default is to go to war. Even with ourselves, maybe especially with ourselves. When there is something that we feel like we're uncertain about, like I was saying a moment ago, like we don't even trust what's coming up inside, that initial tendency is to go to war. It was one of the first things I saw when I started this practice. When I found that, oh, you know what? I do have an issue with panic disorder. But my biggest issue with panic disorder isn't the panic itself. It's the degree to which I am engaging in this civil war with myself to try to stamp out any kind of experience of panic, which ironically was causing a lot of panic. And that's why I've, from almost day one, I mean, literally it was like day 2 of my practice, for the past 25 years, I've worked very hard to try to reframe, get away from this motif of battle and war, which tends to be the one that we default into for pretty much everything, right? Like we had the war on drugs for those of us in the United States, right? Politicians are always in some kind of a showdown. If there's a disease, war on cancer, any sort of thing. Things have a tendency, particularly in Western society, to always get framed in this battle motif, this war motif, this me against you, or in this case, me against me. And is that helpful? Is that skillful? I find again and again, not so much. If anything, it's just draining. And even when it's well-intentioned, I think just by the fact that the fact that we continue to engage in that kind of a motif, even for things where it seems like it's not so bad, say like war on cancer. Who's going to be against a war on cancer, right? But when we continuously engage in that kind of motif, that kind of framework for things that are external to us, is it any surprise that we then engage in that kind of thinking when we're talking about working with ourselves? Well, no. Then when there's some part of us that we don't like, we go to war with it. Well, I don't want this here. I'm going to stamp it out. In fact, I said in one of the first sessions I had with the psychologist who got me started on this practice, he said, okay, so why are you here? And I described what I was going on with my panic. And I literally said to him, so that's my issue, panic disorder, panic attacks. And I said to him, I'm here so you can help me kill it. That's exactly what I said to him. I'm here so you can help me kill it. And he smiled a little bit and he said, well, I don't know that that's necessarily the way that we want to go about this. Perhaps it's better to find a way to manage it. And I thought to myself, no, I want to kill it. Spoiler alert, he was right. He was right. What I'd been doing for almost 10 years at that point was trying to kill it. And that's what landed me in his chair with depression and anxiety and agoraphobia based on panic disorder. Was almost 10 years of trying to kill it. And in the process, kind of metaphorically killing myself, if not literally killing myself slowly, right? So that's something I always try to notice is, where am I engaging in a battle motif here? Especially with myself, but even outwardly. It doesn't really help outwardly either, right? Not going to help in our relationships. I always notice that. Am I engaging in a battle motif here? Am I going to war with something? And is that really what I want to do right now? Has that worked for me in the past? Has that been skillful? This is mindfulness. This is mindfulness. Mindfulness often gets translated or conflated with awareness. Mindfulness is not awareness. Awareness is awareness. Mindfulness, as the Buddha taught it, is a function of memory. It's keeping something in mind. More specifically, keeping in mind what we've done in the past that has been skillful. That's what we're doing here. We're experimenting, seeing what the results of our experiments are, seeing what's helpful, seeing what's skillful, seeing what does and does not cause stress and suffering. And then being mindful, keeping that in mind as we go forward and continue to do so and build our skills using the kind of attention that we were working with today. Hey, Lisa Nanda, great to see you again. Yeah, draining. That's exactly it. It's draining. There's now a war on everything, and it just perpetuates the negative speech in society. Yeah. That's another thing. Like, one of the parts of the Eightfold Path in Buddhism is right speech. And right speech doesn't just refer to outward speech, the speech we use to talk to somebody else. It's inward speech, how we're talking to ourselves. Is the way that we are talking to ourselves creating or easing stress and suffering? There's that old saying that if we talk to our friends the way we talk to ourselves, we wouldn't have any friends left. All right? So, what kind of imagery are we using? What kind of themes are we using? What kind of motif are we using? Yeah, exactly. All this negative speech seeps into our consciousness. That's it. And it's coming from our consciousness. It's a cycle, right? Again, it's like the mind thinking about the mind. But the nice thing about cycles is, because it's a cycle, we can just change one part of it. And because it's a cycle, that will perpetuate changes throughout it. So we don't have to change necessarily every part of a cycle. And this is part of what the Buddha taught as well, when he taught about dependent co-arising and so forth. These are complex cycles that also have feedback loops within themselves and can be extraordinarily complex to the point where we can't even really comprehend the whole thing. But we don't have to. We don't have to. Because they're cycles. There are these patterns of causes and effects. We can just change one cause, one condition, and see what that effect is. We have a say on our input of these cycles, because the cycles aren't happening to us. We're generating and perpetuating them. And we have a say. This is what shapes our karma, our experience in the here and now. Outward expressions all come from stress and suffering that's coming from inside. When we are in pain internally and we don't know how to skillfully work with it, well, it's got to come out somehow. This is the kind of stuff we've seen all throughout human history, right? I mean, these teachings from the Buddha come from 2,600 years ago. They've lost no relevancy to us here today. So if we're going to put better things out into the world, we have to start with ourselves. And that's what we're doing in sessions like these. So I'm going to wrap it up there, folks. It seems like a good stopping point. I'm glad this resonated for so many of you. And perhaps next week we'll find something to even build upon this. Work with some more opening and curiosity. And rest of your day or evening, maybe just think here and there, what's the felt sense of the mind, as if it's a physical organ? And what happens when I just take a minute and bring attention to that, some breath energy to that, and just see. Just be open to what comes up. And then bring that into your mindfulness, your memory. Thank you all so much, everyone. Great to see you. Cheers.